Hello and welcome to the TLDR News podcast. This is our very special election podcast. We cancelled the podcast a couple of weeks ago. We didn't think we'd be back as soon as we are, obviously. But on Wednesday, Rishi Sunak made a shock announcement and told the country that we are going to the polls on July 4th.
Yeah.
July 4th. This is, if I'm right in saying, it's the first July election since 1945.
Yes.
This is correct. And the big question at the moment, I guess, is why. No one really knows why he's gone for it. So I'm just sort of diving straight in here. Ben, do you want to give us your best guess as to why Sunak's called it now?
Yeah, so it's just worth starting by saying that no one knows for sure exactly why. A lot of this is guesswork. The only person who really knows why is Sunak and maybe a couple of his close advisors, but so far they haven't made clear why it is. But we can have a relatively educated guess. Some of his close insiders had already been pushing prior to yesterday for a summer election. The main reason being that the small boat crossings tend to become more prevalent over the summer months, and it was expected that that would undermine his argument that he was stopping small boat crossings. And that would undermine one of his main five pledges.
That's been the centrepiece of his campaign, at least recently, hasn't it?
He's staked a lot of his premiership on that, so that would really undermine him. So there was already a sort of internal argument about doing this. Then some new economic data was released yesterday by the ONS, and it sort of there were two key sort of findings that pushed him into thinking a election would be better happening sooner rather than later. The first one is inflation going down to 2.3%, the lowest it's been for about 3 years. So obviously that was another of his 5 sort of key pledges for being Prime Minister. It makes it look like he's been improving the economy. The second one is that government debt had increased at a higher rate than both the OBR and the government were hoping. So they were hoping that it would be falling, but it's actually increased by about 1 billion in the last year. And specifically in April, it was they were expecting it to be about 19 billion. It was actually about 20 billion. So what that means is that this argument that Hunt might be able to cut taxes later in the year was undermined. So the likelihood, and that was the main argument for an election later in the year, was that Hunt could cut taxes, then have an election, and obviously that should help the Tories. But it was very clear that he's not going to be able to do that. So the argument is that the economy would actually, wouldn't be able to cut taxes later in the year, but at least inflation's quite, he can sort of head into the election campaign with a low inflation rate if he calls it now. So it sort of flipped this conventional thinking on its head, these two figures. And that sort of also built into this argument that summer boat crossings and everything. So it just those two figures sort of flipped the argument right on its head about when the best time was to have an election.
I think another thing worth mentioning is that while obviously the inflation data was the lowest it's been in quite some time, coming at 2.3% year on year, that was still higher than what the markets expected.
Yes.
And it's still above the Bank of England's 2% target. And one of the consequences of that is that, at least according to the markets, the likelihood of interest rate cuts in the next couple of months is now lower. It's now basically less than 50%, again, according to the markets, because there are basically betting markets where you can infer sort of what the market predicts about certain events. And I think that's another reason that he's gone early, is that if interest rates had been cut, then in the next couple of months, towards the end of the year, when everyone thought the election was going to be held, you would see mortgage rates going down and maybe some relief there. But if interest rates aren't going down, then his best bet is to go and look, at least things are going down. At least inflation as a headline figure in the aggregate is going down, even if that doesn't necessarily mean there'll be interest rate cuts. Rory, any other theories,
not a huge amount to add to that, but there's this whole argument that there's a few imminent crises, whether it's Thames Water, universities, these kind of things, that they think maybe it's better to have those on the other side of an election than before an election. But fundamentally, I do just think it's because now is as good as it's going to get. I think the Conservatives might have realised that everything they've tried to do to turn around their fortunes ahead of an election hasn't really been changing the polls at all, and actually waiting longer isn't giving themselves time to recover. It's just longer for them to decline. So I think I think he wanted to avoid that. I do wonder if he...
Can I just push back on what you said? This is as good as it's going to get.
Yeah.
So I think we're all sort of making the argument now after he's called the election. We're all sort of going, he's probably thinking this. But before we called the election, the conventional wisdom was he should wait until November, because then there was reason to think that things would be on the up.
Yeah.
So NHS waiting is supposed to come down over the year. Sure, there'll be an increase in small boat crossings in the summer, But if Rwanda flights get off the air in the next couple of months, which is sort of the current timeline, or at least what the government is hoping for, then maybe you'd see some sort of deterrent effects by the end of the year. And then also on the economic news, again, we've had some pretty good headline figures, but no relief really felt by your sort of average Brit. Like real wages are still lagging behind inflation, or at least there hasn't really been much time for them to catch up. Mortgages are still very, very high. They'll probably be a bit lower towards the end of the year. Why don't you buy into that conventional wisdom?
I honestly...
Give me a good answer right now.
Yeah. I think
why doesn't Sunak buy into it?
What I would really like to know is was this a really last minute decision that happened this week, or has he always been planning since the start of this year to have it early July? Because that, I think then if we knew the answer to that, then we could come to different conclusions. But it appears like it was quite a sudden decision. But then he's been saying second half of the year for quite some time now, and this does just about fall into the second half of the year. So I get the impression that maybe this has been what they were gunning for, but...
I think it was sudden. There's some more evidence that it was sudden. I think for starters, you probably wouldn't... It's been in quite a leaky ship so far.
True, yeah, we would have known.
We would have known something was happening. The other thing is that there was some tentative evidence that they booked various venues very, very late in the day.
That's true,
and there was some sort of like mug and poster templates that went up on the Conservative website very late in the day. I think all that is very circumstantial, but that does suggest that it's very last minute. Also, the vibes are very last minute. Like they would have planned a better speech than just sort of in the pouring rain, looking very miserable, like an unlucky prefect.
Can we discuss the speech very quickly? Because the speech is just
go on, get out of your system.
There's a lot of reasons that people are sort of like calling out, and rightly so. You know, him doing it in the pissing rain is just not a very good sort of start to a campaign, really, is it? And obviously, everyone's talking about the fact that the 1997 Labour anthem, things are only going to get better, with playing in the background from a boombox just outside Downing Street.
Yeah, you say background, but if you look at the live videos, it's the only thing you can
hear. It's the foreground, that's, you know, they're very well commented on and rightly so. But the thing that I don't think people are talking about too much is just the content of the speech itself and how terrible that was. In addition, the fact that he sort of started the speech by talking about his time as Chancellor and the pandemic. I think if I was in his position, the last thing I would want to be doing is reminding the public of the pandemic and the actions of the Tories in that, specifically, you know, things like Partygate. Just bear in mind that this is a Prime Minister that was fined.
I think I disagree though.
Really? Because I also think it makes it. I also think it.
Well, you're not going to have a chance to say.
Just very, very quickly. Let me finish my point, and then because I haven't even got to the proper point yet. I think it's the. I think it's just the fact that reaching back that far makes it seem like you haven't done too much as Prime Minister. Trying to sell to the public your successes as Chancellor implies that you haven't done anything that you want to sort of like comment on as Prime Minister. And starting that speech, going all the way back to the pandemic, I don't think is a very good indication.
I agree with the fact that it shows that maybe there's not a huge amount to be proud of since the furlough scheme. But I can see his logic because... that was when he was at his peak of popularity, and I think he wants to remind people about that. You know, he wants people to think that, you know, there are these big successes that people used to praise him for and that they might have forgotten about. But also, I think going back to the pandemic was part of this wider strategy I mean, they've been doing it for ages now, but saying we've had the pandemic, we've had Ukraine, we've now got war in Gaza. Reminding the public that these are unprecedented times, there's lots of challenges, and that's actually why everything's bad. You know, that's the message he's trying to put across.
Just on that note, the one thing that made me slightly irritated is in his speech, he was like, and we've had the war in Ukraine, and the next sentence was, which has had a terrible impact on your energy bills.
Yeah.
And I was like, come on, like this is nearly World War III and energy bills.
Yeah. Just on that,
I think Rory had something else to say.
Oh, sorry.
If I did, I can't remember where I was going to go. But maybe it'll
come back.
You might spark it.
I just feel like that's all well and good saying that, you know, that was when he was popular and you want to remind the public of that. But what he's doing now is trying to get the public to keep him in his current position. And I think saying that I previously did a job well doesn't make the public say, I want to keep you in your current job.
Yeah, I don't think it will work.
No one thinks it will work.
I don't think it was a terrible strategy. But also the thing I was going to say is that it was quite funny that he listed these crises that we faced, but then obviously skipped over the mini budget and everything that came after that. Because obviously that's one thing he doesn't want to remind people of.
No.
But you did really get a sense from that speech of what the Tory campaign is going to look like. Basically saying Labour has no plan. Keir Starmer's changed his views on everything, and we've got a plan that we just trust the process, trust the plan. Basically, that's his pitch, and I really I just don't see it working.
It's terrible, isn't it? Trust the plan. The plan
Yeah.
hasn't worked so far, guys, but don't worry, trust the plan. I think the plan, at least as he sees it, is like sort of small c conservatives, fiscal responsibility, keep debt, well, it's still rising faster than we wanted, but debt eventually falling, that sort of thing. The only thing I was going to say, so I think, sure, we now know for sure what the substance of the Conservative campaign is going to be, but we've also got a sense of the style, and the style is going to be chaos. You know, I mean, it really does seem like one of the most disorganised number 10 operations we've ever seen. I think you got a real sense of that in the aftermath when he was trying to get to the Excel Centre. And for those of you who don't know how, the way around London, it's just this bit of like, it's in East London, and it's where they were holding their first campaign event. And it was so chaotic that they had to, some journalists had predicted in advance that he'd be there, and they had to physically manhandle the Sky journalists out of it. And it was all looking so the thick of it, it's embarrassing.
Yeah, and also the reaction from Conservative MPs, by all reports, has been very, despondent by the sounds of it, despondent or angry.
But also even ministers didn't know about it. I mean,
until the cabinet meeting.
It goes to show how disorganised it is. With the fact that David Cameron didn't know there was an election coming and nearly off to Albania, the day it happened is astonishing.
To be fair, he doesn't need to know about the election, does he? He's not being elected.
This is true, but I think in general it's good to keep your cabinet.
They're going to use, I think he'll be used very heavily, because he doesn't have to stay in a constituency and worry about his local vote. They can just send him around the country doing his no-tie, sleeves rolled up kind of speeches. But again, I'm not sure it's going to be enough.
Can I offer a couple more tentative reasons I think people haven't really mentioned? So a couple of other people have mentioned the reform, basically. And again, the conventional wisdom before Sunak announced the election was that he would be going for November because that's when Nigel Farage would be busiest with his American stuff and therefore least likely to come back and sort of head up reform, which are already about 15% in the national polls, 10-15%, and plus Nigel Farage, I mean, that could really take them up. I think it's not implausible to say to 20%. I mean, say what you want about Nigel Farage, but he is genuinely popular with parts of the electorate, and he's at least like a savvier political operator than Richard Tice, who's currently leading reform. But in retrospect, it looks like it might have been quite a wise move for Sunak to go now, at least if his main anxiety is reform, because basically reform only fielded 300 candidates in the local elections because they just don't actually have like a party machine. This is something that's sort of like overlooked when you're thinking about UK politics, is that success for a party isn't just about how it's doing in the national polls, it's also about like whether or not it has like party machinery, a whole sort of like ground game to like mobilise their vote in key places. This is what the Lib Dems are very good at, for example. That's why they win so many by-elections. They've got loads of volunteers and stuff who can go out and canvass and sort of like doorstop. And Reform's a very new party, and it's sort of like centred around a couple of key politicians, so it doesn't really have that infrastructure. And they really struggled during the local elections. I mean, they make up some excuse like, oh, we're not fighting it because whatever it was something to do with like, we don't want to give Labour a clean sweep or something along those lines because they thought they'd split the Tory vote. But it was also fundamentally just because they couldn't find 300 reform-minded, viable candidates. You know, it's very, just imagine reform, it's very hard to find reform candidates. And when by calling the election now, he's essentially rushed them, and they have no time now to find 650 candidates to field across the UK. I mean, they've got a month to find 650 candidates, and I imagine they've made basically no progress on that front. So that's just not going to happen. And I think that is what has basically scared Farage off reheading reform.
Well, the other thing, and we put this in the video today, is that usually you in a longer campaign you have a lot more time to vet your candidates. And UKIP had a real problem when they were running in 2015 with candidates who had sort of said dodgy things in the past and sort of brought the party into wider disrepute. Now, Farage has been very clear in the last few years that he's wanted to try and move beyond that. The way that reform is set up in its actual structure is, by its very nature, designed to not do a UKIP. You know, he has full control. The leader has full control of the party. Like, there are no leadership elections. It is Farage and Tice that are in charge. So the idea that he sort of comes back and has to be held accountable for a ton of different, because they don't have time to vet candidates in the short campaign.
But also he has to do it personally.
Well, yeah, exactly. And they also had an issue, I think it was a couple of months ago, where they'd already had a couple of candidates for like council candidates that were called out for some comments previously. And I think Richard Tice had said something like they're letting the media do the vetting for them almost, like they're letting these things come out and then deselect them because they don't have the infrastructure in place to do the vetting themselves. So issues like this are only going to become more prevalent in the next few weeks in this short campaign. And I think this is sort of another reason that Sunak might have called the election, is that he doesn't have many cards really to play at the minute. The polling is, pretty terrible. But one that he did have is this element of surprise. And this can work against both Reform and Labour. Labour probably don't have a manifesto written. So
no, they don't. They haven't got it finished.
Yeah.
One of their MPs was on Katie Balls' podcast, Women with Balls, and she admitted that they didn't have a manifesto finished yet.
Yeah, well, there you go. So the likelihood is that they're going to try and let Labour sort of like write this, maybe the leadership will end up writing it and end up coming up with some, hastily written promises, which will maybe frustrate different factions within the Labour Party and start factional infighting. There's that, and then you're also catching Reform out on their candidate selection. So there is some advantage in springing this election on people, and I think maybe sort of that's another reason he's called it. No one was expecting. I think we all at various points mentioned different months. I think July is the only one no one mentioned. Yeah.
The last reason I wanted to say, I think we talked about this a couple of podcasts ago, is conferences.
Yes.
And I think we had an argument where you said that he wanted to do conference, didn't you? Because you thought it'd be a good opportunity to like demonstrate unity, get some money as well. And I made the argument at the time that I get where you're coming from there, but two things make me think that actually he's done well by avoiding conferences. And the first is that Labour would have raised a lot more money than the Tories. Labour are clearly the sort of favourites of business at the moment. And the second is, I understand that he would have hoped to use conferences as an opportunity to sort of show unity and sort of like get the Tory MPs to rally around the flag just before the election. But I think more likely it would have been beset by infighting, and you would have had those weird fringe events where people like Nigel Farage turn up to give very controversial speeches about how the leadership is rubbish.
Yes.
And so I think in that sense he's done pretty well there by avoiding conferences. I think conferences would have been a really stark contrast between a slick sort of pro-business, very popular Labour operation, and then a slightly chaotic, quite extremist Tory operation. That's what we saw last year.
To an extent, I agree, but I think in avoiding the factional infighting that would have been highlighted at conference, he's now frustrated a load of backbench MPs who are going to lose their jobs a lot sooner, who are already talking about sending in no confidence letters and all this. So he's avoided one set of factional infighting, and in doing so has caused another set. I don't think there's any way you can avoid the factional infighting. Admittedly, it's going to be less on time. Less time as well. Very much rock and a hard place on the.
It is a difficult one because people have been saying he's made a big gamble or he's been bold or whatever, but I think it would have been a gamble had he called it as soon as he was elected leader. But we're at the point now where it was either going to be, he's called it for July, but if he didn't call it for July, it would have been a few months later.
Yeah. It's a bit like that surprise paradox. Do you know what I mean? If I say I'm going to surprise you on Friday, it can't be Friday. Then know it can't be Thursday. It can't be Wednesday.
The time was narrowing, and we were, Labour they might not have their manifesto ready, but they're basically ready. They knew an election was coming within a matter of months. So I feel like it's not as I think the timing is not as big a deal as it might first appear to be.
Okay. All right, if you were, so obviously one of the reasons at the time I think people think timing is a surprise is the polls are so miserable for the Conservatives at the moment, and then they are 20-something points behind, depends on which pollster you ask. The trend has been down for really from recent memory. I mean, I can't really remember when it started going up again since Sunak came into office. If you were his chief of staff, you're James Forsyth, I'm putting you on the spot. Okay. How would you win this election? What would be your best bet? If you're Rishi Sunak right now, you're trying to figure out how can I overcome a 20-point deficit? How can I do a sort of Jeremy Corbyn 2017
I think thing? It's difficult because there's things that come up in the campaign that you just can't predict. But I think, you would have to... the issue, this isn't an answer, but the issue is that because Sunak as a personality isn't popular, then you think, well, he shouldn't be the face of the campaign, it should be the party and other members, but then that David also Cameron. David Cameron.
So your strategy is give up the reins to David Cameron.
And then I guess, this is what they're going to do, but attack Labour a lot. But the problem is, if you attack Labour and say,
you've got to give me more details than attack Labour.
I think the difficulty is...
Sorry, I did put you on the spot here.
they say Labour will take us back to square one. Labour have no plan. Stick with us for stability, or whatever. But saying Labour will take us back to square one now has no. People
Meaning.
don't look at that and think, oh, that's scary. Like, I think Labour are doing the right thing by going for this change sort of strategy. Everything is branded with change because they know that after 14 years, people just want change. And I don't know how Sunak and the Conservatives can overcome that just inner feeling that people want change.
What topics would you focus on if you are Sunak? What topic will you try and make the centre of the election? You could do the economy, you could do immigration, you could do public services, you could do foreign policy.
Foreign policy and security probably is the best.
Security, you think?
Yeah, something like that.
But there's a judicial system crisis going on right now. Do you think we can really make a plausible pitch on
global security.
Global
as in, this is a difficult time. And I don't know if Labour lead the Conservatives on like foreign policy and sort of military stuff, but I'm pretty sure it's closer than, say, immigration, NHS, that type of thing. I think you have to avoid the economy, avoid the NHS. I mean, not to the point where you're not talking about it, but don't make that the centre of your campaign. I think it's got to be a focus on...
It's quite difficult to make foreign policy the centre of a domestic campaign. It's very rare that...
Yeah, because then you sort of come across as quite out of touch if you're talking about everything that's happening on the world stage, but ignoring the fact that people, are struggling domestically. That can really put people off. But I think that'd probably be my best shot.
I think
there's a reason I'm not a Tory strategist.
Yeah. I think you just have to get the note from 2010 saying there's no money left and bring that up at every available
Sincerely,
opportunity.
how would you win the election?
So, I think I sort of agree with Rory that, well, the first thing you've got to do is try and get Labour to be as, have as much factional infighting as the Tories as much as you can, because I think that's the biggest divide.
Stir the pot,
so you really want to stir the pot, specifically with, I think foreign policy is your best bet if you're going to do that. So you really want to push Starmer into coming up with some sort of like definitive statements on Gaza, for example.
So Gaza's the one that is currently the big sticking point
no matter
within
what
Labour
he says, no matter what he says, it will frustrate some element of the Labour Party. So you really want to try and pin him on that as much as you can and get them fighting amongst themselves. Which is why, and also I think you can frame the international element as almost as an economic point, and I think you've already seen him start doing this. So you can say that a lot of the economic problems in the UK are based on wider foreign policy issues. So Ukraine, for example. So you're saying if you want to try and reduce bills at home, you've got to have a strong foreign policy, and Labour have no plan. Labour don't know what they're doing. Labour has no plan on Gaza. They're fighting themselves on Gaza. They're fighting themselves on Ukraine. So if you want your bills to come down at home, you've got to make sure that you've got a party that can sort out foreign
I know policy. It's a bit cruel of me to ask you how would you reduce a 20-point deficit and then pick holes in your solution.
Yeah.
But I'm just on that point. I think that doesn't really work for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, again, as I said to Roy, I think you can't. Foreign policy just is never the centre of a dressing campaign. One other thing, and I think you're right that they're trying to link the war in Ukraine to the sort of economic issues at home, but there isn't actually much dissent within Labour on Ukraine. I mean, most of the sort of like anti-NATO Corbynite wing have been silenced essentially. And the thing that they do have dissent on, which is Gaza, doesn't really have any impact immediately on sort of the UK's domestic economic issues. So one of the things I think I disagree with both like slightly on this is that you both were like, oh, he can't fight the election on the economy. I actually I think he is going to try, and I also don't think it's a completely futile strategy. I think for a couple of reasons. I mean, the main reason is I think that even if the Tories don't look great on the economy, which I think is true, even if the recent data has been pretty good, I think one of the things we haven't mentioned, by the way, is that with the last GDP data, quarterly growth of 0.3%, that's really good. I mean, that translates to an annual rate of like 1.3, which doesn't sound amazing, but these days that's pretty great. What focusing on the economy does is it reminds people that in lots of ways the Labour pitch is quite boring. And if you focus on public services, then Wes Streeting could do his whole spiel about like NHS reform and all that sort of thing. But if you're just focusing on the big macro economy stuff, Labour have committed to the same fiscal targets as the Tories, and therefore by implication, they really don't have much more spending room. And the spending that they do want to do, they're very vague about how it's going to be funded. And some of the taxes aren't popular. I mean, the ones that are popular, stuff like taxes on private schools, but there are taxes on, so scrapping non-dom, for example, and then they flirt with some sort of asset taxes, which would implicitly probably be basically targeting pensioners. And if you can try and force Labour into a hole on that, I think you do two things. I think one, you illustrate that actually Labour's spending plans aren't as generous as probably like parts of the left of the electorate would like or hope. And I think you also can try and force them to consider, so if you are going to be more generous, who's paying for this? Like, who are you going to tax to do it? And I don't know if it'll get a result, but I think it, at the very least, makes Labour look a bit, not dishonest, but uncomfortable, and reminds people that in certain ways, Keir Starmer is boring, you know? Fiscal policy, and I understand why he is, and I actually think it's probably the safest bet, but fiscal policy, he is boring. And I'm not saying that you're going to win an election on that, but you might close the gap a little bit by going like, look, we're both really boring, you know?
Yeah.
Things aren't good.
Do you think, it's a bit of a taking us off course here, but can you think of an election in modern British history where we've had two leaders who are as I don't want to be mean, but they are both quite boring and both not very charismatic and both not hugely.
Major?
Yeah, I guess. I don't know, what was John Major sort of.
Yeah,
what was he?
very
He was
boring.
known
Yeah.
as the grey man on Spitting.
yeah.
They painted him fully grey on Spitting Image because he was that
Brown
boring.
Cameron
Yeah.
thing is not. I mean, Cameron was shiny.
He was young,
but he was still small C conservative in lots
Yeah.
of ways. No,
but
I
it
don't
really
think so.
it's
but-
not a clash of personalities, is it at all? Versus like Corbyn v Johnson. It's so different.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think. By the way, I think one of the things it's probably a bit too early. I think to rule out Starmer as boring. I think Starmer has been boring, but I think part of that circumstance. I think he's new to the job. I don't think he was particularly comfortable in the limelight to begin with. I think you've seen tentative evidence in more recent media appearances that he's become more media savvy, more media competent than he used to be. But also because he had to be boring because he couldn't say anything. His game was, I'm going to fix internal Labour Party issues before I start fighting the Tories properly. And I think now that he's basically silenced the Corbynite wing of the party, and he now has the freedom, given it's campaign season, to start pushing out some policies, to start saying some more interesting stuff, he might turn out to be a bit more interesting than I think we give him credit for.
And
I
also,
think this is underpriced generally, by the way.
Yeah, I think there's an element of what might be considered like a boring personality that in some ways it can come across as like comforting and welcome to a lot of people.
Yeah.
After a lot of chaos in politics in recent years, and there is that fine balance between that type of boring and the other type of boring where people don't really know anything about you apart from the random attack ads that are sort of filtered through. But
I also think there's Sunak and Starmer. I think Sunak has gone in the opposite direction of Starmer. I think he's become a worse media performer over time because it's something we disagreed with ages ago when you thought he was going to be perform well under pressure in the media.
So wrong.
And I was like, no, he's terrible. He can only do it when he's chancellor and handing out loads of money. And over time, he's become snarkier and more irritable and angry, and that's understandable because of the situation he's in. But at the same time, I think Starmer has become calmer, more honest, sort of more personable, and so I think they're both boring. But I think Sunak, I don't. This is not meant as an ad hominem. This is just sort of like as he appears to the public. He has a sort of angry boring, like an irritable boring. You know what I mean? Like he's not positive. Whereas I think Starmer's boring is closer to calm or assured at the moment. And I think those are two very different types of boring. And one is something you quite like in a leader, if they're being calm and assured and confident. And maybe Starmer's not fully there yet, and maybe this is rose tinted glasses, but he might get there. And whereas the other one, which is sort of irritable, slightly snidey.
I do agree with all that. I would just say that they're both really bad at the zingers. Like they're really bad at the whole.
Starmer's terrible at the zingers.
They're really bad at doing the jokes. And I think when we get into actual debates, that's going to be the interesting one to watch because you have to do that. You're trying to it's almost like you're debating in an almost school ground type setting in front of everyone, and you sort of have to lean into that a little bit. And they're both quite bad.
Apparently, the Tories and Sunak's team wants to try and get as many debates against Keir Starmer as possible,
Which is interesting
because so that suggests that they think that Sunak comes out on top in these kind of things and is also.
But I don't know if it does.
More,
so again, I think let's go back to the economy thing. I think it's not that they think he comes out on top. I think that it just narrows the gap. It reminds people that Starmer is not a 23-point leader. You know what I mean? He's not Tony Blair. Let's not be silly here, guys. And sure, he might be a bit better than Sunak, but I think they're hoping that actually that sort of brings it down to 10 points.
And also, Sunak doesn't have as much to lose as Starmer does.
Yes.
Exactly, every media, every debate on
risky,
TV, that's an opportunity for Sunak to gain ground, where it's an opportunity for Starmer to lose momentum, lose, votes, I suppose.
I think they're just hoping for another, the finance brother thing that failed the other week in PMQ,
Yeah.
hoping for another like failure like that in a TV debate.
This is a question mainly for Ben, if that's all right, Rory. But do we have any historical like parallels? Do you know what I mean? Has there ever been a case where, I mean, not necessarily the government, but like has the Labour-Tory gap narrowed by 20 points over the course of a campaign in history?
No, so for at least post-war history, they've never called an election with the incumbent this far behind.
Such a shame. I thought we were going for some Disraeli stuff.
No, sorry, I don't know about it. I mean, even if we did, the public opinion polling is so different now that it wouldn't even be comparable anyway. But we just haven't. And the really remarkable thing, and the thing to bear in mind here, is that way back in 2019, when Johnson won that huge majority, all the discussion was that he'd be sort of this big leader for the next sort of like 10, if not longer, years, and that in sort of like modern British history you'll have sort of Churchill as a leader, Thatcher as a leader, Blair as a leader, and probably Johnson, because he won such a huge majority and he's likely to sort of retain that the next time.
For what it's worth, I do think that Johnson's political coalition was really quite impressive and almost unstoppable. I think, he, by the way, he preceded that the thing that we've seen across Europe, which is like what's often described as the far right, but what is actually sort of socially conservative but economically liberal. He sort of like, he did that first.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It really worked.
But this is why people gave him so much credit for winning that, because it was a totally almost new strategy at the time, and it paid off big time. But the assumption was that Labour had no chance of winning the next election, because the swing required for Labour to win this election, would even to win a majority of one, would be the biggest swing in post-war history towards a party that had lost the previous election.
That's amazing thinking back to
so
that.
So if you think back to that in the context of this, him potentially winning quite a large majority here would have been absolutely unfathomable back in 2019.
That's a really good point.
So if someone came from the future and said Keir Starmer wins a massive landslide, what do you think you'd imagine would have happened over the 5 years from 2019?
Yeah, well, I'd have imagined maybe a very short-lived prime minister that sort of like tanked the economy. I mean, to be fair, when you know what happened in the last 5 years, it's not too surprising. It's just worth remembering that it is unprecedented what's happened in those intervening years.
The last question, so that's pretty despondent stuff for Sunak, but the last question I want to ask is and I know that this is not a perfect analogy, because obviously it was a Labour leader sort of catching up to an incumbent Tory leader. But I'm going to ask you, what can we learn from the 2017 Corbyn experience? Is there can Sunak do a reverse Corbyn in that sense? Can he catch up to, the Starmer, who's Theresa May in this analogy?
Well, potentially. I mean, anything can happen, right? So there is a chance. But the reason that 2017 happened the way that it did is Theresa May's campaign was dreadful, just dreadful from start to finish. And not only was it dreadful, there were tons of things that just went wrong throughout the campaign period. It was this sort of perfect storm of it already being quite an awful strategy, but then also just so unfortunately for her, there was a ton of like gaffes throughout the campaign. The decision not to really do debates didn't work for her. The whole
dementia tax was 2017.
Yeah, dementia tax as well. Like, it was a badly run campaign with gaffes throughout. So, of course, if that happens with Starmer, if the manifesto comes out and there's some absolute clangor of a policy in there that his party turns on him for, sure, polling can turn. Just to be clear, polling is only a reflection of public opinion at the time that it's called. It's not meant to be predictive. So,
but the takeaway there is that, and I think you're right, is that actually that is a story as much about Theresa May's shortcomings as it is about Corbyn's success.
Yeah, precisely.
So effectively, Sunak has to hope.
He has to hope that Starmer makes a series of big blunders that he can capitalise on.
I don't think, my point is that I don't think there's a way that Sunak can sort of unilaterally improve his polling. He needs to hope that Starmer fucks something up somewhere.
Okay. I think that is everything. So I think all in all, I mean, not a hot take. We don't think things are going great for Sunak.
No.
We can't really imagine him winning.
Not at this point, no.
And we have some tentative explanations for why he's called it, but we're also a bit bemused.
Yeah. I think everybody is.
Okay, so good use of your time. Well, thank you very much for watching. I don't actually know when we'll be back next, but we will definitely be back next week at some point, probably quite early in the week. I reckon it'll be a busy weekend, no?
Yeah.
But we will be doing this again, I can't really commit to anything, at least semi-regularly for the next few weeks until the election, rather.
Thanks for watching. There might be a podcast at some point
Just
in the next
check
few
in.
weeks.
You know, it might happen.
Yeah, subscribe and ring the bell.
There you
So,
go.
you know,
That's
that'll-
the
that'll
one.
help.
Yeah.
The instinctive YouTuber among us.
Yeah.
All
Thanks,
right.
Rory.
Thanks, Mr.
All right.
Beast. Yeah. See you later.
Don't forget to buy
Bye.
Feastables.